There are many ways in psychology that have been devised to measure a person's personality. Although many people refer to these as being personality tests, it's worth remembering that in psychology, we don't really like using the word test too much. The reason is that a test implies that there is a passing or a failing score, or that there are right or wrong answers. However, that isn't really the case when we're measuring personality. We're not trying to find if somebody has the right personality or the wrong personality. We're just trying to evaluate what type of personality they have. For that reason, oftentimes we refer to these not as being tests, but rather as being inventories or batteries or scales. In today's video, you're going to hear me refer to some of them as being tests, not so much because that's what they're called, but just to make it easier for y'all to understand what I'm saying. Otherwise, I think I'll have a lot of viewers wondering why I'm talking all of a sudden about batteries in a video that's supposed to be about ways of measuring personality. It's worth noting that when we talk about measuring personality, we really have two categories of how this is done. The first category is what's known as self-report inventories, and the second includes projective personality tests. I'll start with talking about the self-report inventories and then cover the projective tests. A self-report inventory is kind of what you'd think of when you think of a test. There are set questions with different possible answers associated with those questions. Sometimes with self-report inventories, the questions may be multiple choice. They may be yes or no. They may be true, false. They also may be organized in a scale where you are asked how likely you are to engage in a certain behavior or how much you agree with a statement. These scales are specifically referred to as a Likert scale, and you do see them a lot in different types of measurements of personality. Generally speaking, self-report inventories tend to be much more reliable. Most of them are standardized and are mostly considered valid ways of measuring a person's personality. That being said, be very careful because there are a lot of personality tests out there that may look very legitimate, but are not. One of the most widely recognized self-report inventories is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI for short. This inventory is extremely precise, but it's also extremely long. A person taking the MMPI may take hours to take this test and must answer hundreds of different questions. It's a very highly regarded personality inventory and is frequently used as a diagnostic tool in clinical practice, but also in other settings. For example, the MMPI is frequently given to candidates who want to work in law enforcement as a screening tool. It's also given to determine whether somebody qualifies for social services, and even occasionally in helping to determine whether a defendant can stand trial for a crime. Because the MMPI is used in such sensitive areas, it is important that it has mechanisms in place to determine whether somebody is intentionally being untruthful. After all, a person potentially standing trial for a crime is going to have a lot of incentive to lie on a personality test to make them seem like they're suffering from a mental health disorder. Likewise, for a person who may get disability payments or a person who is emotionally unstable wanting to be a police officer because they'll be in a position of authority over other people. The MMPI has a built-in mechanism to detect whether a person is being dishonest, and without going into too much detail about it, it does this through showing how consistently a person answers similar questions. So basically, over the course of several hours and hundreds of questions, if you don't show consistency in how you answer those questions over that time frame, it can indicate that the person may be potentially lying. There are other ways that the MMPI ensures that people are not intentionally lying on it. It's also worth noting that the MMPI alone isn't necessarily the only thing that is considered when making a diagnosis, but rather is one of many tools used by therapists. Another good example of a self-report inventory is something called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or MBTI. The MBTI is a much easier self-report inventory to take. Usually it involves just a few dozen easy questions rather than hundreds, and can usually be taken within about 10 or 15 minutes. However, it's not as precise as the MMPI. I like to explain it this way. The MMPI is like a portrait of somebody's personality. It's very detailed, but also takes a long time to do. The MBTI is more like a snapshot of a person's personality. So it isn't as detailed or accurate, but it is much quicker. There are different versions of the MBTI, but most of them give you a 4-letter type indicator of certain key personality traits. There are 4 key elements of traits that the MBTI measures. The first is extroversion versus introversion. The second is sensing versus intuition. The third is thinking versus feeling. And the fourth is perceiving versus judging. Generally, when a person takes the MBTI, they'll be given not just the 4 letters that correspond to these types of traits, but also told how strongly they associate with that trait. So for example, I am an ESTP, which stands for extroversion, sensing, thinking, and perceiving. I usually rate pretty high in extroversion and perceiving and pretty low in sensing and thinking. Moving on, I wanted to talk about the other category of personality tests, and these are known as projective tests. The projective tests are generally not as valid or reliable as the self-report inventories. These tests are largely left up to the person who is evaluating them and their interpretation of how the person responded. So for that reason, they tend to be very subjective. These include some of the most famous tests in psychology, though. For example, if you've ever heard of the Rorschach Inkblot test, this is an example of a projective personality test. Essentially, what happens is a person looks at an image that's created by randomly blotting a piece of paper with ink. Typically, this is a folded piece of paper, so when it's open, it basically makes a mirror image of itself. The left side looks identical to the right side. The idea is that the image isn't really meant to look like anything in particular. It's left up to the interpretation of the person who's being asked what the image looks like. Originally, this stems from the psychoanalytical perspective in psychology, and the idea was that by doing this, it was sort of like a window into the patient's unconscious mind. A more modern form of the Rorschach Inkblot test is called the Thematic Apperception test, or TAT for short. With this test, a person sees an actual image instead of just random blots of ink on a piece of paper, but the image is meant to be intentionally vague. So for example, you may see an image like this and be asked what you think is going on in the scene. The concept is still the same, though, as with the Rorschach Inkblot test, in that it's left up to the interpretation of the person being asked. The final projective test that I'm going to discuss is something called the Rotter Incomplete Sentence Blank, or RISB. With this task, a person is given the beginning of a sentence and must finish the sentence in their own words. This can either be done in writing or it can be done verbally. So here's an example. If the start of the sentence is something like I feel or I regret, then you'd have to finish that sentence. My experience is that all of the projective personality tests tend to not be used to make a diagnosis. Rather, they're usually used more times than not to kind of like break the ice or just to get a conversation started. So for example, if you answer the question, I feel, by saying angry at my mom, that opens the door for a therapist to ask questions about how your relationship is with your mother. These aren't used as diagnostic tools, and that if you answer them a certain way, it doesn't mean you automatically have a mental health disorder. That's just not how these tests are used. This also by no means is a comprehensive list of all the different ways in which psychologists and therapists in general measure a person's personality. Rather, it's just some of the more important and well-known ways in which we do it. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great day.